Kalen Rowe pushed his mop bucket down the long hallway of the Orion Grand Theater, the squeak of the wheels echoing off the marble walls like a lonely heartbeat. It was past midnight, and the grand old building was finally quiet. No applause, no chatter, no rustle of expensive dresses or the clink of champagne glasses. Just the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional drip from a leaky faucet somewhere backstage. He was used to this silence. In fact, he preferred it. Kalen wasn't a performer. He wasn't a director, a stagehand, or even part of the lighting crew. He was the man who came after everyone else left, the one who wiped up spilled soda, swept glitter off the floor, and made sure the velvet seats were free of forgotten programs. To most people who passed through the theater's gilded doors, he didn't exist. And that was fine by him. At 38, Kalen had learned to move through life like a shadow. He wore the same faded navy uniform every night, kept his dark hair neatly trimmed, and spoke only when spoken to. He lived in a small apartment above a laundromat 3 blocks away, where the constant thump of washing machines provided a strange kind of comfort. His rent was cheap, his needs were few, and his routine never changed. But there was one thing no one at the theater knew about him. Every night, after he finished his rounds and locked up the building, Kalen would stop by the empty auditorium on his way out, not to check for trash or misplaced coats, but to listen. The Orion Grand was home to one of the finest concert grand pianos on the West Coast, a gleaming black Steinway that had been played by legends. Even when silent, it seemed to hold music inside it, like a deep breath waiting to be released. Kalen would stand in the back row, hands in his pockets, just staring at it. Sometimes, if the stage lights were still on from rehearsal, the polished wood would catch the glow and shimmer like liquid night. He hadn't touched a piano in public for over 10 years. But he still dreamed in notes. His love for music had started young. He grew up in a small coastal town where winters were gray and long, and the only color in his childhood came from the old upright piano in his grandmother's parlor. She'd taught him his first scales when he was 6, her wrinkled hands guiding his small fingers over the yellowed keys. By 10, he was playing Chopin by ear. By 15, he'd won a regional competition that earned him a scholarship to a prestigious music conservatory in Boston. For a while, everything seemed possible. He remembered the first time he walked into the conservatory's main hall, how the air smelled of rosin and old wood, how the light filtered through tall windows onto rows of empty chairs, how the silence felt sacred. He'd been surrounded by people who spoke the same language he did, not with words, but with phrasing, dynamics, and timing. But life had other plans. His grandmother fell ill during his 2nd year. Then his father lost his job. The scholarship covered tuition, but not rent, food, or medical bills. Kalen started working nights at a diner, then weekends at a moving company. His practice hours shrank. His hands grew rough. His focus splintered. Then came the final blow. His mentor, Professor Elian Voss, a quiet man with silver hair and eyes that saw right through pretense, passed away suddenly from a stroke. He'd been the one who believed in Kalen most, the one who said, "You don't play the piano to impress. You play because silence hurts too much." After the funeral, Kalen packed his things and left Boston without saying goodbye. He drifted west, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place too long. Music became something he kept locked away, like a letter he was too afraid to reread. He told himself he was fine, that he'd moved on. But every time he heard a piano in a cafe or caught a snippet of a concerto on the radio, something inside him tightened, like a string pulled too far. Now in Portland, he'd found a kind of peace in invisibility, no expectations, no disappointments, just the steady rhythm of work, sleep, and the occasional late-night walk along the river. But the Orion Grand had changed that, just a little. This week, the theater was preparing for its annual Rising Virtuosos Showcase, a high-profile event that brought in wealthy donors, critics, and music school scouts. The hall buzzed with energy during the day, pianos being tuned, spotlights adjusted, programs printed. Kalen watched it all from the edges, unnoticed. He'd seen the young performers come and go. Most were teenagers with perfect posture and designer shoes, trailed by anxious parents and managers with clipboards. They played with technical precision, their fingers flying over the keys like machines. Impressive, yes, but to Kalen something was missing. There was no ache in their music, no story, One evening after the last rehearsal, he stayed behind to clean the stage. The grand piano sat open, its lid propped up like a waiting mouth. A stagehand had forgotten to close it. Kalen sighed, muttering under his breath about careless kids, and walked over to do it himself. But as he reached for the lid, his fingers brushed the edge of the keyboard, and just like that, memory flooded back, the weight of the keys, the resistance before the note sounds, the way middle C used to vibrate through his chest when he played it softly. Before he could stop himself, he sat down, not to play a piece. Not to show off, just to feel it again. His right hand hovered, then pressed a single key, G above middle C. The note rang out clear and warm, bouncing off the empty walls. It was louder than he expected. He froze, glancing toward the wings, half expecting someone to yell at him. But the theater was empty, so he played another. Then another. Not a song, just a few chords drifting like smoke. A simple progression in E minor. Something he'd made up years ago during a sleepless night in Boston. His fingers remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The calluses from mopping floors didn't stop them. If anything, they made the touch firmer, more deliberate. For 3 minutes, Kalen wasn't a janitor. He was just a man talking to a piano, saying all the things he hadn't said in a decade. Then he heard a door creak. He jerked his hands away as if burned, heart pounding. The music died instantly. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked over the bench, but no one was there, just the wind through a cracked window backstage. Still, the moment was broken. Shame crept in. What was he thinking? He wasn't supposed to be up here. This wasn't his place anymore. He closed the piano lid gently as if apologizing to it, and finished his cleaning in silence. But that night, back in his apartment, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed staring at the wall. Then he walked to the corner where his own piano stood, a battered upright he'd bought for $50 at a garage sale. 2 keys didn't work, F was an A, but he'd learned to play around them. He sat down and played the same E minor chords from earlier. This time he let them grow, added a bass line, let his left hand wander into deeper registers. The notes filled the small room, bouncing off the thin walls, mingling with the distant thump of washing machines below. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good by conservatory standards, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, Kalen felt like he could breathe. The next morning, he went to the laundromat's owner, Mrs. Lynn, to pay his rent. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and kind, and had long suspected Kalen carried some quiet sorrow. "You look different today," she said, counting his crumpled bills. "Do I? You're lighter. Like you slept," he almost smiled. "Maybe I did." Back at the theater that night, the energy was even higher. Posters for the showcase were up in the lobby, gold lettering on black background listing names like Elira Voss, Theo Mendez, and Leanne Araki. Kalen recognized Elira's name. She was the headliner, a 19-year-old prodigy who'd already performed with 2 major orchestras. Her photo showed a serious young woman with intense eyes and hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. During soundcheck, Kalen mopped near the wings, trying not to listen. But Elira's playing was impossible to ignore. She was playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, the same piece Kalen had once tried and failed to master. Her version was flawless, fast, precise, powerful. The staff clapped when she finished. Kalen kept mopping. But later, as he emptied trash bins in the green room, he overheard 2 stagehands talking. "Did you see Elira leave?" one said. "Yeah, she looked awful. Pale as a ghost. Heard she threw up twice in the dressing room. Something she ate at lunch. Oh no, not tonight, right before the showcase. Mireille's freaking out. No understudy. No backup plan." Kalen didn't react. He just kept working. But the words stuck in his mind. That night, after everyone left, he returned to the auditorium again. The piano was closed. He hesitated, then opened it. He sat, and this time, he played the Rachmaninoff. Not the whole thing, just the opening chords. Slowly, carefully, feeling the weight of each note, the drama in the pauses, the storm building beneath the surface. He'd never played it well before, but now, with 10 years of silence behind him, he understood it differently. It wasn't just about speed or power. It was about despair, about standing at the edge of something vast and dark, and choosing to speak anyway. He played until his fingers ached. Then he closed the lid, turned off the lights, and walked out into the cool Portland night. He didn't know it yet, but someone had heard him, and that someone was about to change everything. The morning after Kalin played the Rachmaninoff, the Orion Grand Theater felt like a beehive with a broken lid. People rushed in every direction, stagehands dragging cables, costume assistants steaming gowns, interns sprinting with clipboards and coffee. But beneath the organized chaos, there was a new kind of tension, the kind that comes when something important is about to go very wrong. Elira Voss hadn't shown up for her final rehearsal. Mireya Cho stood in the center of the backstage area, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. At 42, she'd run the theater's programming for nearly a decade, and she prided herself on never panicking. But today, panic was knocking hard on her door. The showcase was in less than 24 hours. Tickets were sold out. Major donors were flying in from Seattle and San Francisco. And the star performer, the one whose name had drawn half the audience, was lying in bed with a fever of 102, barely able to keep water down. "She can't do it," Mireya said quietly to her assistant, who looked like she might cry. Even if she could stand, her hands would shake. Her timing would be off. It wouldn't be fair to her or to the audience. "But we don't have a backup," the assistant whispered. "We never needed one before." Mireya knew that. The Rising Virtuoso showcase wasn't designed for understudies. It was built around the idea of perfection, flawless young talents delivering flawless performances. There was no room in that vision for illness, mistakes, or humanity. She walked to her office, poured herself a cup of black tea, and stared out the window at the gray Portland sky. Rain tapped gently against the glass. She thought about canceling, but canceling meant refunding thousands of dollars, disappointing patrons who'd planned their weekends around this, and possibly losing the trust of the board. The Orion Grand had been struggling financially for years. One misstep like this could push it over the edge. Her eyes drifted to the program on her desk. Elira's photo smiled back at her, confident, polished, everything the showcase stood for. Mireya sighed and tossed the program into the recycling bin. Then she heard it, faint at first, like a whisper through the walls. A piano. Not the crisp, precise playing of the young virtuosos, but something slower, deeper, haunting almost. It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded lived in. Mireya frowned. Rehearsals were over for the day. The hall should have been empty. She followed the sound down the corridor, past the dressing rooms and the prop storage, until she reached the double doors of the main auditorium. She pushed one open slowly, and there he was. Kalin Rose sat at the grand piano, still in his Navy janitor uniform, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His back was straight but not stiff. His hands moved over the keys with a kind of quiet certainty that surprised her. He wasn't playing anything she recognized, just a series of chords that rose and fell like breath, weaving together sorrow and hope in a way that made her throat tighten. She stood in the shadows, not wanting to interrupt. She'd seen Kalin around for years, always quiet, always efficient, always invisible. She'd never once thought to ask his name until last month, when the payroll system glitched and she had to track him down for a signature. Now, watching him play, she realized how wrong she'd been. This wasn't just someone who knew how to hold a mop. This was someone who understood music in his bones. He hit a final chord and let it fade into silence. Then, as if sensing her presence, he turned. His eyes widened. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked the bench over. "Ms. Cho, I'm sorry," he stammered, face flushing. "I shouldn't be here. I was just closing the lid. I swear I didn't mean to." "It's okay," she said, stepping forward. Her voice was softer than she intended. "You play beautifully." Kalin looked down at his hands like they'd betrayed him. "I haven't played in public in over 10 years. But you still play," he hesitated. "Only when no one's listening." Mireya studied him, the tired lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. She'd seen that posture before. It was the look of someone who'd been told over and over that they didn't belong. "Who taught you?" she asked. "My grandmother. Then for a while, Professor Voss." Mireya blinked. "Elian Voss?" Kalin nodded. "You knew him?" "He was on our advisory board for years. Brilliant man." "Terrible cook." She smiled faintly. "He mentioned a student once, someone he said played like he was listening to ghosts. Was that you?" Kalin didn't answer. but the way his shoulders tensed told her everything. She took a deep breath. Elira's sick. She can't perform tomorrow. Kalen's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered toward the piano. I know it's not my place, Mireya continued. But would you consider playing in her stead? The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Kalen shook his head almost immediately. No, I can't. Why not? I'm not ready. I'm not good enough for this stage. You were good enough for Ellie and Voss. That was a lifetime ago. Mireya stepped closer. Look, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be honest. What you just played, it had more heart than anything I've heard all week. These kids are technically brilliant, but they're playing for judges, for scholarships, for Instagram. You're playing because you have to. Kalen swallowed hard. What would I even play? Whatever feels true. He looked at the piano like it was a cliff edge. People will laugh. I'm the janitor, Ms. Cho. They'll think it's a joke. Then let them laugh, she said firmly. But I'd rather have real music on my stage than perfect silence. She didn't press him further. She simply handed him a key card. The theater's yours tonight. Practice as long as you need. Decide by morning. Then she walked away, leaving him alone with the piano and his ghosts. Kalen didn't move for a long time. He just stood there staring at the empty seats, imagining them filled with strangers who expected brilliance and would only see a man in a worn uniform. But then he thought of Professor Voss, of the way the old man used to say, music isn't about the audience. It's about the truth you're brave enough to share. He sat back down. This time he played for himself. That night, Kalen didn't go home. He stayed at the theater, pacing the stage, running his fingers over the piano keys without pressing them, testing the air like a diver checking the water. He knew he should say no. It was safer, smarter, less humiliating. But something in him had cracked open the night before, and now it wouldn't close. He called his sister, Nia. From the payphone in the lobby. His phone had died weeks ago, and he hadn't bothered to replace it. Kalen? Her voice was groggy. It was past 1 a.m. in Boise, where she lived with her 2 kids and worked as a school librarian. Is everything okay? I played the piano tonight, he said quietly. A pause. Then softly. At the theater? Yeah, another pause. Longer this time. Did anyone hear you? Mireya Cho did. Nia exhaled. Oh, Kalen. They want me to perform tomorrow, in place of the headliner. What did you say? I said no. But you're calling me, so you're thinking about saying yes. He didn't answer. Listen, she said gently. You've spent 10 years pretending you don't miss it. But I've heard you, brother, late at night when you think I'm asleep. You hum melodies under your breath. You tap rhythms on the kitchen table. Music didn't leave you. You just stopped letting it speak. I'm scared, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Of course you are. But what's the worst that happens? You play badly, people forget your name by next week, and you go back to mopping floors. But what if it's not bad? What if it's exactly what you needed? He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he returned to the stage and played until his fingers cramped. He tried the Rachmaninoff again, slower this time, focusing not on the notes but on the spaces between them. He remembered how Professor Voss used to say, "The silence is where the music lives." By dawn, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his hands ached. But for the first time in years, he felt awake. He found Mireya in her office, already sipping coffee, dark circles under her eyes. I'll do it, he said. She didn't smile, didn't cheer. She just nodded, like she'd known he would all along. What will you play? Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. Her eyebrows lifted. That's Elira's piece. I know. But it's not hers. It's everyone's who's ever felt lost. Mireya stood and walked to the window. I won't announce the change until right before you go on. Less time for people to question it. Thank you. And Kalen. Wear something other than your uniform. He almost laughed. I don't own a suit. I'll find you one. She called the costume department, and by mid-morning a tailor was measuring him backstage. The suit was old, donated years ago by a performer who'd played Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, but it fit surprisingly well. Navy blue, slightly worn at the cuffs but dignified. As the day wore on, the theater buzzed with last-minute preparations. Kalen stayed out of sight, hiding in the lighting booth while the crew tested spotlights and sound engineers adjusted microphones. He watched the young performers arrive, nervous, excited, adjusting their cuffs and smoothing their dresses. None of them noticed him, except one. Leon Araki, a 17-year-old pianist from Vancouver, paused as she passed the booth. She squinted at him. "Hey, aren't you the cleaner?" Kaylin nodded. "You're still here?" "The show's tonight." "I know." She tilted her head. "You look different," he didn't answer. She shrugged and walked on. By evening, the lobby was filling. Limousines pulled up. Women in sequined gowns stepped out, followed by men in tuxedos holding programs like sacred texts. Donors mingled with critics. Cameras flashed. Kaylin stood in the wings, heart hammering. He'd changed into the suit. It felt strange, like wearing someone else's skin. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. Mireia found him there. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes, I do." She handed him a small glass of water. "Breathe. The piano isn't your enemy. It's your friend." He nodded, but his stomach was a knot. Backstage, the first performer, Theo Mendez, walked on to polite applause. Kaylin listened from the shadows as the young man played a dazzling listitude, fingers flying, audience murmuring in admiration. When he finished, the applause was warm, appreciative. Then Leanne played, a delicate Debussy piece that shimmered like moonlight on water. The crowd was entranced. Each performance raised the stakes. Kaylin felt smaller with every round of applause. Finally, it was almost time. Mireia stepped onto the stage to make the announcement. The audience quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "due to unforeseen circumstances, Elira Voss is unable to perform tonight." A ripple of disappointment moved through the room. However, we are honored to present a special guest, a musician whose connection to this theater runs deeper than most realize. She paused. "Please welcome Kaylin Rowe." Silence, then confusion. People looked at their programs, then at each other. "Who?" Kaylin stepped into the light. He didn't walk with confidence. He walked like a man walking toward something he couldn't escape. The murmurs grew louder. Some people frowned. Others leaned forward, curious. He reached the piano, sat down, placed his trembling hands on the keys, and then everything else fell away. The first chord of the Rachmaninoff rang out, deep and mournful, filling the hall like a sigh from the earth itself. And the audience stopped breathing. The first chord hung in the air like a held breath. Kaylin didn't rush the next one. He let the silence settle, let the weight of that single sound sink into the room. His fingers hovered, not out of fear now, but out of respect. For the music, for the moment, for the man he used to be and the man he might still become. Then he played the second chord. And the third, it wasn't perfect. A note here was slightly flat. A phrase there came a hair too slow, but none of that mattered. Because what poured out of the piano wasn't just notes, it was a story. A story of loss, of silence, of years spent hiding in plain sight. Every accent, every pause, every swell of volume felt earned, like he'd lived every bar before ever playing it. In the front row, an elderly woman clutched her program to her chest. 2 rows back, a teenage boy who'd been scrolling on his phone lowered it slowly, eyes wide. Even the stagehands peeking from the wings stood frozen, mops and cables forgotten in their hands. Kaylin didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the keys, but he could feel the shift in the room, the way the air thickened, the way the usual rustle of programs and whispered comments vanished. It was the kind of silence that only happens when something real is happening. He reached the stormy middle section of the piece, the part where Rachmaninoff unleashes a cascade of thunderous chords. Most performers played it fast, almost aggressively, showing off their power. But Kaylin played it like grief, heavy, relentless, but never angry. Each chord landed like a footstep in deep snow, slow, deliberate, leaving a mark. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm passed. The music softened. The tension eased. The final chords returned to that same mournful tone from the beginning, but now it felt different. Less like despair, more like acceptance. When the last note faded, Kaylin kept his hands on the keys. He didn't move. He couldn't. His chest rose and fell quickly like he'd just run a mile. Sweat dotted his forehead. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Then, applause. Not polite clapping. Not the kind people give out of obligation. This was real, raw. Some people stood immediately. Others wiped their eyes before joining in. The sound rolled over him like a wave, warm and overwhelming. He stood slowly, awkwardly, and gave a small bow, just a nod, really, before walking off stage as quickly as he could. Back in the wings, Mireia was waiting. She didn't say anything. She just put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. Her eyes were bright with tears. "You did it," she whispered. Kalen shook his head. "I just played." "No," she said. "You spoke." He didn't stay for the rest of the evening. He changed out of the borrowed suit, folded it neatly, and left it on a chair in the costume room. He slipped back into his janitor uniform, grabbed his mop bucket, and finished his rounds like nothing had happened. But everything had. As he locked up the theater later that night, he paused at the front doors and looked back at the darkened auditorium. For the first time, it didn't feel like a place he was just passing through. It felt like a place that had seen him. The next morning, Kalen woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand, a cheap, prepaid model he only used for emergencies. He never got calls, but today it wouldn't stop. He answered on the fifth ring. "Hello, Kalen. It's Nia." Her voice was shaky with excitement. "Have you looked online?" "No, why? Just turn on the news." He hung up, confused, and switched on the small TV in the corner of his apartment. The local morning show was playing. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Mystery Pianist Stuns Orion Grand Audience." His stomach dropped. The footage showed him walking onto the stage in the borrowed suit, head down, shoulders tense. Then it cut to a wide shot of the audience, some standing, some crying. A clip of his hands on the keys. Then a soundbite from Mireia. "He's been part of this theater for years. Last night he reminded us all why we're here." Kalen turned off the TV. His phone buzzed again. Texts from old friends he hadn't spoken to in a decade. Voicemails piling up. A local radio station had already left 3 messages asking for an interview. He sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands. This wasn't what he wanted. He hadn't played for fame. He'd played because he couldn't not play. By noon, a reporter from the Portland Chronicle showed up at the laundromat below his apartment. Mrs. Lynn turned her away, but not before snapping a photo of Kalen through the window, unshaven in a faded t-shirt, holding a cup of instant coffee. That photo ended up on the front page the next day with the headline, "The Janitor Who Stole the Stage." Kalen stopped answering his phone. He still went to work that night, hoping the theater would be quiet, normal, but it wasn't. Staff members he'd passed in silence for years now greeted him by name. The stagehands clapped him on the back. Even the security guard, a gruff man named Dale who rarely spoke to anyone, nodded and said, "Heard you last night." Sounded like heaven. Kalen just nodded and kept mopping, but Mireia found him during his break in the staff lounge. "You can't hide from this," she said, sitting across from him at the chipped formica table. "I'm not hiding. I'm working. You're running." He looked down at his coffee. "I didn't sign up for interviews. For photos. For people calling me inspirational. I just played a piece of music, and now people want to hear more. Why? Because I clean floors and can press piano keys? That's not a story. That's a gimmick." Mireia leaned forward. "It's only a gimmick if you let it be. But you have a choice now, Kalen. You can disappear again, or you can use this moment to say something that matters." He didn't answer. Later that week, a package arrived at the theater addressed to him. Inside was a brand new digital piano, compact weighted keys perfect for small spaces. There was no note, just a return address, a music store downtown. When Kalen called to thank them, the manager said, "It's from a customer who heard you play. He insisted on paying in cash and asked us not to give his name." Kalen knew. It had to be Darian Kessler, the music critic who'd sat in the third row, known for tearing performers apart in print. If even he was moved enough to do this, maybe Mireia was right. Still, he didn't touch the new piano for days. It sat in the corner of his apartment like an accusation. Then one rainy evening he couldn't sleep. The old upright was out of tune again, and the missing keys were driving him crazy. He walked over to the new one, lifted the cover, and pressed middle C. The sound was clean, clear, true. He played for an hour, then 2. He didn't play anything fancy, just scales, simple melodies, fragments of ideas that had been stuck in his head for years. But for the first time, he wasn't fighting the instrument. It was working with him. The next night, he returned to the Orion Grand after his shift and asked Mireia if he could practice on the Steinway. "Of course," she said. "It's your piano now, too." He started coming every night. Not to perform, just to play. Sometimes Mireia listened from the back row. Sometimes she brought coffee. They never talked about the future. They just let the music fill the space between them. One evening, as he was leaving, he saw a group of teenagers lingering near the stage door. They looked nervous, clutching sheet music and worn backpacks. "Can we ask you something?" One of them finally said, a girl with braids and paint-stained jeans. Kaylin nodded. "Are you really the janitor?" "I am, but you played like you've been doing it your whole life." "I have, just not here," she hesitated. "My teacher says I'll never get into a conservatory because my technique isn't clean enough. But when I heard you, it made me think maybe music isn't just about being perfect." Kaylin looked at her, really looked. He saw himself at 16, hopeful, uncertain, desperate to be seen. "Music isn't about perfection," he said gently. "It's about truth. If you're honest, the notes will follow." The girl smiled. "Thanks." As they walked away, Kaylin felt something shift inside him. Not pride, but purpose. The next day, he went to Mireia's office. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up from her desk. About what you said. About using this moment." She set down her pen. "Go on. What if we opened the theater to kids like that girl? The ones who love music but can't afford lessons? What if we held free workshops? Late-night rehearsals for anyone who wants to play, no matter their background?" Mireia's eyes lit up. "You're serious?" "I am. The Orion Grand shouldn't just be for the polished and the perfect. It should be for anyone who needs to speak but doesn't have the words." She stood and walked to the window. "The board won't like it. It's not prestigious, it doesn't bring in donors." "Maybe not," Kaylin said. "But it brings in people." She turned to him, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Then let's do it." They spent the next week drafting a proposal. The Open Stage Initiative. Free access to practice rooms after hours. Volunteer teachers from the local music community. Monthly informal recitals where anyone could play. No auditions. No judgment. Kaylin even agreed to lead the first session. The night before it launched, he visited his grandmother's favorite spot in Forest Park. The bench overlooking the river where she used to take him as a boy. He didn't bring flowers. He brought sheet music. He sat on the damp wood, the city lights flickering in the distance, and played a simple melody he'd written just for her. The notes drifted over the water, carried away by the wind. When he finished, he folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He wasn't the same man who'd hidden behind a mop bucket a month ago. He wasn't trying to be famous. He wasn't even trying to be great. He was just trying to be honest, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The night of the first open stage session arrived with the light rain tapping against the Orion Grand's tall windows. Kaylin stood backstage, adjusting the chairs in the small recital room they'd set aside for the event. It wasn't the grand hall, just a modest space with worn carpet, a second-hand upright piano and folding chairs, but to him, it felt more sacred than any concert stage. He still wasn't sure anyone would come. The flyer had gone up only a week ago, posted at community centers, libraries, even laundromats. No fancy design, just plain text, free piano practice, all ages, all levels. No judgment, just music. Mireia had insisted on keeping it simple. "If we make it sound too official," she'd said, "people will think they're not welcome." Now as the clock ticked towards 7, Kaylin checked his watch again. The room was empty except for him and a stack of donated sheet music on a side table. Then the door creaked open. A boy of maybe 10 shuffled in, clutching a tattered notebook. His shoes were too big, his jacket slightly damp from the rain. He looked around nervously like he'd walked into the wrong place. "You here for the session?" Kaylin asked gently. The boy nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "What's your name?" "Tavi." "Nice to meet you, Tavi. I'm Kaylin." The boy didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. He hovered near the piano like it was a wild animal he wasn't sure would bite. "Ever played before?" Kaylin asked. "A little, at school, but they said I was too slow." Kaylin smiled. Speed doesn't make music. Feeling does. He pulled out a chair. Sit, play anything you want. Even if it's just one note. Tavi hesitated, then sat. His fingers trembled as they touched the keys. He played a simple C major scale, halting, uneven, but earnest. When he finished, he looked up, expecting criticism. Instead, Kalen said, "You listen to each note." That's rare. More people trickled in over the next half hour. A retired schoolteacher who'd played as a girl but hadn't touched a piano in 40 years. A college student with dyed blue hair who wrote her own songs but was too shy to sing them. A single mother with tired eyes who said, "I just wanted to hear real music for once." Kalen didn't teach them technique. He didn't correct their posture or scold them for wrong notes. He just listened. And when they played, he made sure they knew they'd been heard. By the end of the night, Tavi was playing a short melody he'd made up on the bus ride over. The college student sang a verse of her song, voice shaking but clear. The retired teacher played a Chopin waltz she'd memorized in 1963, tears in her eyes as the notes came back to her like old friends. No one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence afterward was full enough. As people left, many thanked Kalen, not for teaching them, but for making them feel safe. He stayed late, turning off lights and stacking chairs. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled fresh, washed clean. He didn't know it yet, but that small gathering would ripple farther than he imagined. Over the next few weeks, the open stage nights grew. Word spread through neighborhood chats, music forums, even a local podcast that featured Kalen in a short segment titled, "The Janitor Who Gave Music Back to the People." Attendance doubled, then tripled. Mireya arranged for a rotating group of volunteer musicians to help, some former students, some retired performers, all drawn by the same idea that music shouldn't be locked behind auditions and tuition fees. Kalen still worked his night shift. He still mopped floors and emptied trash bins. But now, sometimes, a performer would pause mid-rehearsal to say, "Hey, I heard you play last week. That piece about the river, it wrecked me." And Kalen would just nod and keep cleaning, but inside, something warm would bloom. Then came the invitation. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, hand-delivered to the theater's front desk. Inside was a formal letter from the Portland Symphony, inviting Kalen to perform as a guest soloist at their spring gala, a high-profile event attended by city officials, arts patrons, and national press. Mireya handed it to him during his break. "They want you to play the Rachmaninoff again." Kalen stared at the letter like it might burn him. "I can't. Why not?" "It's too much. Too soon. You've already played for hundreds. This is just a bigger room. But the expectations..." He shook his head. "Last time no one knew who I was. They listened with open ears. Now they'll listen to see if I'm the real deal. I don't want to be a spectacle." Mireya sat across from him. "Then don't be. Be yourself. Play like you did that first night, like no one's watching." He didn't answer right away. That evening, he went to the grand hall and sat at the Steinway. He played the Rachmaninoff slowly, not as a performance, but as a conversation. Halfway through, he stopped. The piece no longer felt like his. It felt like a costume he'd outgrown. He closed his eyes and let his hands wander. What came out was something new. Fragments of melodies he'd hummed while mopping, rhythms he'd tapped on buckets, harmonies that echoed the sound of rain on the theater roof. It wasn't polished. It wasn't even finished. But it was his. When he finished, Mireya was standing in the back row. "What was that?" she asked. "Something I've been carrying," he said. "I think I'd rather play that," she smiled. "Then play that." He wrote back to the symphony the next day. He'd accept, but only if he could premiere an original piece, not the Rachmaninoff. To his surprise, they agreed. The night of the gala arrived with a buzz that hadn't been seen at the symphony in years. Tickets sold out in hours. Reporters camped outside the venue. Cameras flashed as donors in evening wear stepped from cars. But Kalen didn't arrive in a limousine. He walked from his apartment wearing the same navy suit from the Orion Grand Showcase, now neatly pressed with a fresh white shirt underneath. Backstage, he paced quietly, hands in his pockets. He didn't warm up on a practice keyboard like the other soloists. He just breathed. Mireya found him 10 minutes before showtime. "Nervous?" "A little." Remember why you're doing this. Not for them, he said. For Tavi. For the woman who hadn't played in 40 years. For everyone who thinks music isn't for them. She squeezed his arm. Then you're already home. The audience was even more elegant than the Orion Grand crowd, jewelry glittering, programs held like fine art. When the conductor introduced Kaylin as a voice that emerged from the quiet places, a murmur rippled through the hall. Some looked curious, others skeptical. Then Kaylin walked on. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply sat, placed his hands on the keys, and began. The piece had no name yet. He'd been calling it After the Rain in his head. It started with a single low note, deep, resonant, like the first drop hitting pavement. Then a simple melody rose in the right hand, hesitant at first, then gaining strength. The left hand wove a gentle rhythm beneath it, steady as a heartbeat. There were no flashy runs, no thunderous climaxes, just honesty, the kind of music that doesn't demand attention. It earns it. Halfway through, a man in the third row, Darian Kessler, the critic, leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes closed. He wasn't taking notes. He was just listening. In the balcony, Tavi sat with his mother, eyes wide, hands clasped like he was praying. Kaylin played like he was alone in the room, like he was back in his apartment above the laundromat, playing for no one but the walls. And because of that, the audience leaned in. They forgot their phones, forgot their expectations, forgot everything but the sound. When the final note faded, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the hall erupted, not just applause, cheers, whistles. People standing so fast their programs fell to the floor. Kaylin blinked, stunned. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted it. But he accepted it with a quiet nod, then walked off before the ovation could grow louder. Backstage, Mireya was crying. The conductor shook his hand and said, "That was the most human thing I've heard in 20 years. But Kaylin didn't stay for the after-party. He slipped out a side door and walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting in puddles left by the evening rain. He didn't feel like a star. He felt like himself, and that was enough." The next morning, a letter arrived at the Orion Grand, addressed to Kaylin in elegant handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music. Thank you, Darian Kessler." Kaylin pinned it to the bulletin board in the staff lounge, next to the open stage schedule, because that's where it belonged, not in a frame, but in the place where music was still being made by ordinary hands, for ordinary hearts. The weeks after the symphony gala blurred together in a strange mix of quiet routine and unexpected ripples. Kaylin still woke before dawn, still made his coffee in the chipped blue mug, still walked the 3 blocks to the Orion Grand with his keys jingling in his pocket. But now people noticed him, not in a loud or intrusive way, just a nod from a stranger on the bus, a shy wave from a teenager carrying sheet music, a barista who started his order before he even reached the counter. The usual, Kaylin. He didn't mind. He just didn't let it change the rhythm of his days. Offers kept coming. A record label wanted to sign him. A national TV show asked him to appear on their morning segment. A university offered him a guest lectureship in performance and emotional expression. He turned them all down, not out of pride, but because none of them felt true to what he'd rediscovered. Music wasn't about contracts or cameras. It was about connection. What he did say yes to was the Open Stage Initiative. With Mireya's help, it had grown beyond weekly sessions. They'd secured a small grant from a local arts foundation, enough to keep the lights on and pay for basic maintenance. They added guitar and violin nights, poetry readings, even silent composition hours where people could write music in shared quiet. The theater, once reserved for polished elites, now hummed with the messy, beautiful sound of ordinary people trying to say something real. Kaylin still cleaned the grand hall every night. But now sometimes he'd find a note tucked under the piano bench. "Thank you for last night. I played for my daughter for the first time." Or, "I finally finished my song. It's about my dad. I'll play it next week." He never responded. He didn't need to. The notes were enough. One rainy Tuesday, as he was wiping down the stage after a youth choir rehearsal, Mireya approached with a folder in her hand. "The board approved it," she said, a rare smile on her face. "Approved what?" "The permanent community music program. Starting next month. The Orion Grant will offer free after-school lessons for kids from underfunded schools. We'll partner with local teachers, provide instruments, even cover transportation. Kaylin stopped mopping. You're serious? Dead serious. And they want you to lead it. He shook his head. I'm not a teacher. You're exactly the kind of teacher they need, she said. Someone who knows what it's like to be told you don't belong, and proves them wrong by showing up anyway. He thought about Tavi, who now came every week and had started composing his own short pieces. He thought about the retired teacher who'd joined a community ensemble. He thought about the single mother who'd brought her daughter to the last session and cried when the girl played her first scale. Okay, he said quietly, but only if it stays free. No auditions, no fees ever. Deal. That same week, a large unmarked box arrived at Kaylin's apartment. No return address, just his name written in neat block letters. Inside was a brand new acoustic upright piano, rich walnut finish perfectly tuned with a small envelope taped to the lid. He opened it. Inside was a note. For the nights when the laundromat is too loud. Kaylin ran his hand over the smooth wood. It was the first new thing he'd owned in over a decade. He didn't call to thank Darian Kessler. He didn't need to. The gift wasn't about gratitude, it was about trust. He placed the piano by the window where the morning light could touch it. That night, he played until past midnight, not practicing, not performing, just talking to the keys like an old friend he'd finally found again. The first day of the after-school program arrived with a burst of nervous energy. 12 kids, ages 8 to 14, stood in the recital room, shuffling their feet and eyeing the instruments like they might bite. Most had never touched a piano before. One boy clutched a violin case with a crack down the side. A girl in the back wore headphones around her neck but hadn't taken them off yet. Kaylin didn't start with scales or theory. He sat at the piano and played a simple rhythm, just 4 beats. Repeated. Clap it back, he said. They did, awkwardly at first. Then with more confidence, then he added a melody, 3 notes rising. Sing it. They hesitated. Then one voice, then 2, then all of them. Shaky but together. By the end of the hour, they were making music. Not perfect, not polished, but theirs. After they left, Kaylin stayed to tidy up. As he stacked chairs, he noticed the girl with the headphones still lingering by the door. You okay? He asked. She nodded, then took a step forward. My mom says I'm too loud, that I should keep my music to myself. Kaylin crouched so he was at her eye level. Music isn't meant to be quiet. It's meant to be shared, even if it's messy. She looked at the piano. Can I try? Anytime. She sat and pressed a single key. Then another. A slow, wandering tune emerged, full of pauses, full of feeling. Kaylin didn't interrupt. He just listened. When she finished, she looked up. Is that okay? That's more than okay, he said. That's you. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and walked out into the fading afternoon light. Months passed. Seasons turned. The open stage nights became a Portland institution. Local news did a follow-up feature, not on Kaylin, but on the kids, on the retired nurse who'd started a jazz trio, on the teenager who'd written a song for her immigrant parents, on the boy who'd never spoken in class but sang backup vocals at the monthly recital. Kaylin still cleaned the theater. He still wore his uniform. But now sometimes he'd be asked to play during intermission of a main stage show, not as a gimmick, just as part of the family. One evening, after a sold-out performance of a modern opera, Mireya found him backstage, wiping down the dressing room mirrors, she said, leaning against the door frame. You could quit. You don't need this job anymore. Kaylin paused, rag in hand. Why would I quit? Because you're famous now. Because you could tour. Record albums. Live somewhere with a view. He looked around the small, cluttered room, the smudged mirrors, the half-empty water bottles, the stray bobby pins on the floor. This is my view, she smiled. You're impossible. No, he said. I'm just finally where I belong. The real turning point came not with fanfare, but with a quiet conversation in the staff break room. A young stagehand named Ren, barely 20, with paint under his nails and a guitar slung over his shoulder, sat across from Kaylin during a late-night coffee break. I used to think you had to be born special to make real art, Ren said, stirring sugar into his cup. Like either you're a prodigy or you're nothing. Kalen sipped his coffee. And now? Now I think you just have to show up. Even when you're scared. Even when no one's watching. Kalen nodded. That's the hardest part and the most important. Ren grinned. Mind if I play something for you sometime? Anytime. By the following spring, the Orion Grand had changed. Not in its gilded ceilings or velvet curtains, but in its soul. The lobby now had a community board covered in flyers for open mic nights, instrument swaps, and beginner jam sessions. The grand piano in the main hall was still used for virtuosos, but also for 8-year-olds playing their first recital, for veterans writing songs about home, for anyone who needed to say something words couldn't hold. Kalen never became a celebrity. He never released an album or went on tour. But in Portland, his name carried a different kind of weight. Not of fame, but of kindness. Of quiet courage. Of showing up when it mattered. On the 1-year anniversary of that first night, the night he'd been told to clean the stage but played instead, the theater held a special open stage night. No theme, no rules. Just music. Kalen didn't perform first. He waited until the end. When it was his turn, he walked to the piano in his usual uniform. No suit, no bow tie. He sat, and he played a new piece, one he'd been working on for months. It had no title, but those who listened said it sounded like rain, like footsteps on wet pavement, like silence finally finding its voice. When he finished, the room didn't erupt in cheers. It simply held its breath, then exhaled together, as if everyone had been waiting for that sound without knowing it. Afterward, as he locked up the theater, Kalen paused at the front doors and looked back one last time. The stage was empty. The lights were off, but the air still hummed with the echo of 100 honest notes. He wasn't the man who'd been told to clean the stage anymore. He was the man who'd reminded everyone, himself included, that music isn't about perfection. It's about showing up even when you're afraid. It's about letting your heart speak even if your hands shake. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. He turned off the last light, stepped into the cool night, and walked home, just a man, a mop bucket, and a heart full of songs he'd finally learned to share.